The courtroom was silent as everyone leaned forward, trying to make sense of what had just unfolded. David, the homeless man everyone had underestimated, stood tall, his tattered jacket looking out of place against the polished wood of the witness stand. In his trembling hands, he held a USB drive, its significance far greater than anyone could have imagined. "I told you I wasn't lying," David said, his voice steady now, despite the tears brimming in his eyes. "And this is the proof." The ex-landlord, Mr. Richard Campbell, a man known for his deep pockets and even deeper influence, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His lawyer whispered frantically in his ear, but the evidence was damning. The courtroom gasped as the screen lit up, displaying a series of incriminating documents and videos. Richard's fraud, the illegal evictions, the threats, it was all there in black and white. "Play the video," David insisted. The judge nodded, signaling the bailiff to proceed. The room filled with audio of Richard's unmistakable voice. His tone was menacing, filled with arrogance as he laughed about throwing David out of his apartment, knowing he had nowhere to go. The room was stunned. No one moved, no one breathed. "Anything else to add, Mr. Campbell?" the judge asked, her tone sharp. But before he could respond, there was a commotion at the back of the courtroom. Someone burst through the doors, shouting something no one could make out. All heads turned, and the tension only grew thicker. It had all started 6 months earlier. David wasn't always homeless. He used to have a decent life. Nothing fancy, but enough to get by. He worked as a delivery driver, lived in a small one-bedroom apartment, and kept mostly to himself. His landlord, Richard Campbell, was a slick businessman who owned multiple properties across the city. David had always thought of him as cold, but fair, until everything changed. It began with a sudden notice pinned to David's door. Eviction notice was stamped across the top in bold red letters. The reason? Late rent. David knew he'd paid on time, and he had the receipts to prove it. He confronted Richard, who smirked and dismissed him. "Prove it," Richard had said, his tone dripping with condescension. "And even if you do, good luck getting a lawyer with what little money you have." David felt the walls of his life closing in. He tried to fight back, but Richard had connections everywhere. Lawyers wouldn't take his case without an upfront payment he couldn't afford. The eviction went through, and David was forced to pack his life into 2 duffel bags and leave. Life on the streets was harsh. David quickly learned that being invisible was both a curse and a survival tool. He spent his days searching for food and shelter, his nights battling the cold and fear. But no matter how much his situation worsened, one thought burned in his mind. Richard Campbell would pay for what he did. The turning point came when David found an old laptop abandoned near a dumpster. It was battered, but it worked. He took it to the public library and started piecing together every scrap of information he could find about Richard. What he discovered shocked him. Richard had a history of illegal evictions, fraudulent tax filings, and bribery. The only reason he hadn't been caught was that no one had dared to challenge him, or had the proof to do so. David vowed to be different. It wasn't easy. The laptop was slow, and the library hours were short. He started digging through public records, interviewing other tenants, and even sneaking around some of Richard's properties late at night. One night, David overheard 2 of Richard's employees talking in hushed tones about shredding files. His instincts kicked in, and he followed them to a storage unit where boxes of records were being destroyed. David acted fast. He borrowed a friend's phone to record everything. He even managed to swipe a few documents before the employees noticed him. Among the papers was the lease agreement for his old apartment, proving Richard had falsified the late rent claim. But the most shocking find was a flash drive taped under a desk in the storage unit. David pocketed it without hesitation. The flash drive was a goldmine. It contained video recordings, emails, and audio files, proof of Richard's criminal activities. But David knew he couldn't just walk into the police station and expect them to believe a homeless man's story. He needed a plan, and he needed allies. David reached out to Susan, an old co-worker who worked as a paralegal. At first, she was skeptical, but when David showed her the flash drive, her attitude shifted. Susan agreed to help, offering her legal expertise and contacts to build a case. Together, they began preparing for the fight of a lifetime. As the weeks turned into months, David grew stronger, more determined. He started speaking to other victims, gathering more evidence, and preparing to face Richard in court. But every step forward came with challenges. Richard's men began following him, and one night, they cornered him in an alley. "You think you're smart, don't you?" one of them sneered. David didn't back down. "Smarter than your boss," he shot back, even as his heart pounded. The men roughed him up, leaving him battered and bleeding. But David refused to give up. If anything, the attack only strengthened his resolve. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was packed, reporters scribbling notes as the case unfolded. Richard's lawyers tried to dismiss David as unreliable, playing up his homelessness as a sign of incompetence. But David stood firm, presenting the evidence piece by piece. When the flash drive came into play, the room grew tense. Richard's arrogance began to crack as the truth unraveled. And then came the final video, the one that left everyone in shock. Richard's smirk vanished, replaced by panic. As the courtroom buzzed with whispers, David glanced at Susan. She nodded, her expression one of quiet pride. But just as the judge was about to speak, the courtroom doors burst open, and chaos erupted. The courtroom froze as the heavy doors swung wide. A man in a crisp black suit stormed in, his face red with urgency. Clutched in his hand was a stack of papers that looked as if they had been grabbed in a hurry. "Your Honor," the man called out, his voice firm and commanding. "I have new evidence that must be presented immediately." The judge frowned, banging her gavel to restore order. "State your name and business," she said sharply, her tone cutting through the rising murmurs. The man adjusted his tie, visibly catching his breath. "My name is Andrew Carver, investigative journalist with the Tribune. I've been conducting an independent investigation into Mr. Campbell's dealings, and what I've uncovered ties directly to this case." David turned to Susan, his mind racing. Who was this guy, and where had he come from? Richard Campbell, seated stiffly at the defense table, seemed to shrink under the weight of Andrew's words. His lawyer frantically whispered in his ear, but Richard's expression betrayed his growing fear. The judge motioned for Andrew to approach. He handed the papers to the clerk, who quickly reviewed them before passing them to her. The judge's face darkened as she flipped through the documents. "Mr. Carver," she said, her voice icy, "why wasn't this evidence submitted earlier?" "It's been a complicated investigation," Andrew replied, choosing his words carefully. "I wasn't sure if I could connect all the dots in time, but after seeing Mr. David's bravery in coming forward, I knew I had to act." The judge gave him a long, measured look before nodding. "Proceed," she said, gesturing for him to continue. Andrew turned to the jury, his voice steady but passionate. "What you've seen today is just the tip of the iceberg. Mr. Campbell has not only exploited tenants like David, but has also laundered money through shell companies, bribed city officials to turn a blind eye to illegal practices, and used intimidation to silence his critics." As Andrew spoke, the courtroom seemed to shrink. All eyes were on him as he laid out a timeline of Richard's corruption, bolstered by the new documents. He described forged city permits, records of illegal bank transfers, and even a network of false witnesses used to cover up Richard's crimes. David felt a mix of emotions: relief, vindication, and a lingering sense of disbelief. For months, he had fought this battle alone. Now, someone else was finally exposing the truth. But the drama wasn't over yet. 6 months earlier, David's fight had seemed hopeless. After the eviction, he had spent his first few nights sleeping on park benches, his belongings crammed into 2 worn-out duffel bags. He felt invisible, reduced to a shadow of the man he once was. One rainy afternoon, David sought shelter under the awning of a downtown coffee shop. As the rain poured, he spotted a familiar face walking by, Susan. He hesitated, embarrassed by his situation, but desperation overruled his pride. He called out to her. "David," Susan said, stopping in her tracks. Her eyes widened as she took in his disheveled appearance. "What happened to you?" David explained everything, his voice breaking as he recounted how Richard had thrown him out with no warning. Susan listened intently, her expression softening. "I don't know if I can help," she said honestly. but I'll try. Susan became David's lifeline. She offered him food, a place to shower, and access to her old laptop. Together, they began piecing together a case. It was slow work, but every small discovery gave David hope. Their first major breakthrough came when David stumbled upon the abandoned laptop. It was old and glitchy, but it became his most valuable tool. Late one night at the library, he unearthed a public record showing that Richard had filed fraudulent eviction notices against multiple tenants. The pattern was clear. Richard targeted those he thought wouldn't fight back: the elderly, immigrants, and people like David. One of the most chilling moments came when David found himself face-to-face with two of Richard's enforcers. He had been following a lead about a storage unit and hadn't noticed the black SUV trailing him. The men confronted him in an alley, their eyes cold and unflinching. "You need to stop digging," one of them said, his voice low and threatening, "or you'll end up in a worse place than the streets." David refused to back down. "Tell your boss I'm not afraid of him," he replied, though his heart was pounding. The men roughed him up, leaving him with bruised ribs and a bloody lip. But David considered it a victory. They were scared enough to try to intimidate him. Back in the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Richard's lawyer stood, his face pale but determined. "Your Honor, this so-called evidence is irrelevant. My client is being unfairly targeted by a smear campaign orchestrated by disgruntled tenants." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Irrelevant? These documents show a pattern of systemic abuse and corruption." Richard's lawyer opened his mouth to argue, but the judge cut him off. "Sit down, counselor." As the trial continued, David felt a surge of hope. For the first time, it seemed like the odds were shifting in his favor. But the fight wasn't over. Richard still had powerful allies, and David knew they wouldn't go down without a fight. Just as the judge was about to adjourn for the day, one of Richard's employees, a nervous young man named Eric, stood up in the audience. His hands trembled as he raised them. "Your Honor," Eric said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I have something to say." All eyes turned to him. David's heart raced. "What now?" Eric stepped forward, clutching a folder. "I worked for Mr. Campbell for 3 years," he said, his voice growing stronger. "And I kept copies of everything." He placed the folder on the witness stand, locking eyes with Richard. "I'm done covering for you," he said firmly. The room erupted in gasps as Eric's words sank in. Richard's face turned an alarming shade of red, and his lawyer frantically whispered in his ear. David felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: victory. But as the judge called for order, he couldn't shake the feeling that Richard still had one last trick up his sleeve. The day wasn't over yet. The courtroom was electric with tension as Eric's revelation sent shockwaves through the room. His folder, thick with documents, sat ominously on the witness stand. David watched as the clerk carried it to the judge, her expression unreadable as she flipped through its contents. Richard Campbell, for the first time, looked visibly shaken. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering furiously. His lawyer, pale and sweating, responded with curt nods, clearly unprepared for this sudden twist. "Mr. Eric Mason," the judge began, addressing the young man. "You understand the gravity of your statement, correct? Are you prepared to testify under oath?" Eric nodded, his face pale but resolute. "Yes, Your Honor. I can't stay silent anymore." The judge gestured for him to take the stand. The room was silent, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. David leaned forward, unable to look away, as Eric raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. "Mr. Mason," the prosecutor began, standing to question him, "you claim to have worked for Mr. Campbell for 3 years. Can you explain your role in his business?" Eric cleared his throat, his voice trembling at first, but growing steadier as he spoke. "I handled administrative tasks, mostly filing, organizing documents, things like that. But over time, I started noticing things that didn't add up. Fake leases, payments going to strange accounts, and eviction notices being prepared before tenants even missed a payment." Gasps rippled through the audience. The prosecutor pressed on. "Did you ever confront Mr. Campbell about these irregularities?" Eric hesitated, his hands gripping the edges of the witness stand. "Once. He told me to mind my own business if I wanted to keep my job. After that, I stopped asking questions." but I started keeping copies of everything, just in case. He motioned toward the folder. Those are the copies. Emails, financial records, even audio recordings. It's all in there. David felt a surge of hope. This was the break they needed, a whistleblower from inside Richard's operation. But the moment was cut short by Richard's lawyer, who stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor," he barked. "This testimony is hearsay and irrelevant to the case at hand." The judge raised a hand, silencing him. "Mr. Mason's testimony is directly relevant." Objection overruled. Richard's lawyer sat down, visibly flustered. Richard, meanwhile, glared daggers at Eric, his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed his teeth might shatter. The prosecutor continued, flipping through the folder. "You mentioned audio recordings. Can you tell us about those?" Eric nodded. "I started recording conversations with Mr. Campbell after I realized how deep the corruption went. I have recordings of him admitting to bribing inspectors, faking eviction notices, and even threatening tenants who tried to fight back." The prosecutor approached the bench, handing a small device to the clerk. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to play one of these recordings." The judge nodded, and the courtroom fell silent. A moment later, Richard's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. "Look, I don't care if they paid or not," the recording played. "Get them out. And if they cause trouble, send the boys to handle it. I'm not losing a dime because some deadbeat thinks he has rights." The impact was immediate. The jury's expressions shifted, their shock evident. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching against their notepads. David felt a swell of vindication, though he knew this was just one step in a long fight. 6 months earlier, David's investigation had hit a dead end. Despite uncovering evidence of Richard's corruption, he struggled to find anyone willing to listen. The authorities dismissed him, citing a lack of solid proof. Even Susan, though supportive, was beginning to lose hope. "Maybe we need to take this to the press," Susan suggested one evening as they sat in a cramped diner, poring over their findings. David shook his head. "The press won't care about some homeless guy's story. We need more." That night, David returned to his makeshift shelter under a freeway overpass, his resolve beginning to waver. But as he lay awake, he thought about everyone Richard had wronged, not just himself, but the countless others who had suffered in silence. He couldn't give up. The breakthrough came when he decided to follow one of Richard's enforcers, a man he recognized from his eviction day. It was a risky move, but David's instincts paid off. The man led him to a storage facility where, late at night, files and boxes were being loaded into a truck. David snapped photos from the shadows, his heart pounding. He recognized some of the boxes. They were from Richard's office. But before he could investigate further, one of the workers spotted him. David barely escaped, running through dark alleys until he was sure he wasn't being followed. He shared the photos with Susan, who was stunned by what they revealed. "This is it," she said, her excitement palpable. "If we can figure out where they're taking those files, we might have what we need." But the closer they got, the more dangerous things became. Susan received a threatening phone call warning her to back off. David found his belongings ransacked one day, his laptop smashed. It was clear Richard's people were onto them. Still, David refused to stop. With Susan's help, he tracked down former employees of Richard's company, hoping someone might be willing to speak out. That's how they found Eric Mason. Back in the courtroom, Eric's testimony continued to unravel Richard's carefully constructed facade. More recordings were played, each one more damning than the last. By the time Eric stepped down from the witness stand, Richard's defense looked like it was crumbling. But just as the judge was about to call for a recess, Richard's lawyer stood once again. "Your Honor, I request a private meeting in chambers," he said, his voice tense. "My client has a matter of great urgency to discuss." The judge frowned. "This is highly irregular. What matter could possibly require such secrecy?" The lawyer hesitated, glancing at Richard, who nodded subtly. "It concerns the safety of certain individuals involved in this case." A chill ran down David's spine. What was Richard planning now? Before the judge could respond, the courtroom doors opened again. This time, 2 uniformed officers entered. one of them carrying a sealed envelope. "Your Honor," the officer said, approaching the bench. "We've just received this evidence from an anonymous source. It's marked urgent." The judge's expression hardened as she took the envelope. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the contents. Her face betrayed no emotion, but when she finally looked up, her gaze was piercing. "Court is adjourned for a 1-hour recess," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "Mr. Campbell, a word in my chambers." As the room erupted in whispers, David exchanged a worried glance with Susan. Whatever was in that envelope, it had just changed everything. The hour-long recess felt like an eternity. The courtroom was abuzz with speculation, whispers bouncing off the walls as reporters jotted down theories. David sat in a corner with Susan, his hands trembling slightly. His mind raced, replaying every twist and turn of the trial so far. "What do you think was in the envelope?" he asked quietly. Susan shook her head, her brow furrowed. "Whatever it is, it's big enough to put the judge on edge. I don't like how Richard's lawyer tried to steer the narrative right before it came in. It feels calculated." David nodded, a pit forming in his stomach. "Do you think Richard's planning something?" Susan hesitated before answering. "People like him don't go down without a fight. Stay alert." The doors to the courtroom swung open, and the bailiff stepped inside. "All rise," he called out. "Court is back in session." David's heart thudded in his chest as the judge re-entered, her expression stern and unreadable. Behind her, Richard and his lawyer walked in, both looking unervingly composed. The stark contrast to their earlier panic sent a chill down David's spine. "Be seated," the judge said, her voice firm. Once everyone settled, she addressed the courtroom. "Before we proceed, I must inform you that the evidence submitted during recess is both significant and highly sensitive. As such, I will be introducing it into the case." Richard's lawyer stood immediately. "Your Honor, I must object. The source of this evidence is unknown, and its authenticity cannot be verified." The judge leveled him with a glare. "The court will determine its authenticity, counselor." "Sit down." The lawyer obeyed, though his lips pressed into a thin line. The tension in the room was palpable as the judge turned to the clerk, who now held a stack of freshly printed documents. "These documents," the judge began, "appear to detail additional fraudulent activities by Mr. Campbell, including payments to city officials and a shell company used to siphon millions of dollars from tenants. There is also mention of offshore accounts tied to properties under his management." A collective gasp rippled through the room. David clenched his fists, the puzzle pieces falling into place. This wasn't just about illegal evictions or unpaid tenants. Richard had been running a criminal empire. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Your Honor, we request permission to cross-reference this new evidence with the testimony provided earlier, particularly by Mr. Mason." "Granted," the judge said. "Mr. Mason, please return to the stand." Eric looked uneasy as he stood, but he squared his shoulders and walked back to the witness stand. As the prosecutor flipped through the new documents, David could see the same names and accounts Eric had mentioned. "Mr. Mason," the prosecutor began, "do these records align with what you observed during your time working for Mr. Campbell?" Eric leaned forward, studying the documents. He nodded slowly. "Yes, these are the accounts I handled, the ones I wasn't supposed to ask questions about. I recognize the names." The prosecutor held up one of the pages. "And what about this payment to a city inspector? It's marked as a consulting fee, but the amount, $250,000, seems excessive for a single consultation." Eric hesitated, glancing at Richard, whose glare could have cut steel. That's a bribe," he said finally. Richard called it insurance to keep the city off his back. The revelation sent another shockwave through the courtroom. Reporters furiously typed on their laptops. Cameras clicked, and Richard's composure began to crack again. 6 months earlier, David had been preparing for a confrontation he knew could cost him everything. His investigation with Susan had led to Eric, whose willingness to cooperate gave them their first real shot at taking Richard down. But the risk was enormous. Richard's enforcers were relentless, tailing David and Susan wherever they went. One night, David woke to the sound of footsteps near his shelter. Peering out from under the freeway overpass, he saw two figures standing near his belongings. He froze, holding his breath as they rifled through his things. "Boss says we need to send a message," one of them muttered. "Burn it," the other replied. Before David could react, one of them pulled out a lighter, tossing it into his few remaining possessions. Flames erupted, lighting up the night. David felt a surge of anger and helplessness, but he stayed hidden, knowing he couldn't fight them alone. The next morning, he found Susan waiting for him at the diner. She took one look at his singed jacket and bruised face and knew something was wrong. "They're getting desperate," David said, his voice raw with emotion. "But I'm not giving up." Susan placed a hand on his. "Neither am I." It was then that Eric revealed he had saved copies of the most incriminating files, hiding them in a safety deposit box. With his help, they began piecing together a timeline of Richard's crimes, documenting every bribe, forged document, and illegal transaction. Back in the courtroom, the tension reached a boiling point as Eric's testimony unraveled more of Richard's web of lies. But the defense wasn't done fighting. "Your Honor," Richard's lawyer said, standing once more, "I move to dismiss this new evidence on the grounds that its source is unverified and potentially tampered with." The judge frowned. "Counselor, the authenticity of these documents has been confirmed. Your motion is denied." Richard slammed his fist on the table, startling everyone. "This is a circus," he shouted, his face red with fury. "I'm being framed." The judge banged her gavel. "Order in the court. Mr. Campbell, you will remain silent or be held in contempt." But Richard wasn't finished. He stood abruptly, pointing at David. "This is all your fault. You and your pathetic sob story. Do you think you've won? You don't know who you're dealing with." David held his ground, meeting Richard's glare head-on. "You don't scare me anymore." The judge called for a brief recess to regain control of the courtroom. As the bailiff escorted Richard out, he leaned toward his lawyer and whispered something. Whatever it was, it made the lawyer's face pale. Susan turned to David. "What do you think he's planning?" David shook his head. "I don't know, but we need to be ready for anything." As they prepared for the trial to resume, David couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. Whatever Richard's next move was, it would be big and dangerous. When the courtroom reconvened, the tension was heavier than before. David sat quietly next to Susan, his mind racing. Richard's outburst had rattled everyone, but it wasn't just his words that stuck with David. It was the eerie calm that followed. It felt like the silence before a thunderstorm. The judge returned, her stern expression unchanged. "Court is back in session," she announced. "Mr. Campbell, any further disruptions from you will result in immediate removal from this courtroom." Richard, seated at the defense table, nodded curtly, though his smirk hinted at defiance. "Prosecution, you may continue." The prosecutor rose, holding another document from the new evidence. "Your Honor, we've identified a series of payments to offshore accounts registered in the Cayman Islands. These accounts are tied directly to Mr. Campbell and are consistent with the fraudulent activities previously discussed. We'd like to call an expert witness to explain these findings." The judge nodded. "Proceed." A middle-aged man in a crisp suit took the stand. He introduced himself as Thomas Blake, a forensic accountant specializing in financial crimes. As he spoke, he explained the intricate web of transactions Richard had used to launder money, avoid taxes, and conceal his wealth. "It's a textbook case," Thomas concluded. "The patterns are clear. This wasn't sloppy bookkeeping or accidental oversight. It was deliberate and methodical." The prosecutor turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a case of negligence. This is a case of calculated exploitation. Mr. Campbell didn't just break the law, he thrived on it." The defense attorney rose for cross-examination, his tone clipped. "Mr. Blake, are you suggesting that every offshore account is used for illegal activity?" "Of course not," Thomas replied evenly. "But in this case, the evidence speaks for itself." The defense attorney pressed further, attempting to sow doubt, but the damage had already been done. The jury's expressions ranged from anger to disgust, and it was clear that the evidence was swaying them. 6 months earlier, David had reached a breaking point. After the attack on his shelter and the destruction of his belongings, He felt the weight of despair pressing down on him. But Susan wouldn't let him give up. "This is exactly what he wants," she told him firmly. "To scare you, to make you feel powerless." "But you're not powerless, David. You have the truth on your side." Her words reignited the fire within him. Together, they met with Eric Mason in secret, gathering more details about Richard's operations. Eric revealed that Richard had bribed city officials to overlook code violations, evicted tenants without proper cause, and funneled money through shell companies. One night, David received a tip from an anonymous caller. The voice on the other end was shaky but determined. "I used to work for him too," the caller said. "There's a file. A big one. It's hidden in his office safe." David's heart pounded. "How do I get to it?" "You don't," the caller replied. "It's too dangerous. But if you can find someone to get it for you, it'll blow the case wide open." Back in the courtroom, the prosecution was wrapping up its case. The jury was visibly swayed, their earlier skepticism replaced by a sense of outrage. But just as it seemed the tide had fully turned, Richard's lawyer stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, we request permission to call a surprise witness." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. David exchanged a glance with Susan, who frowned. "This isn't good," she muttered. The judge hesitated. "A surprise witness? Who? And why weren't they disclosed earlier?" The lawyer adjusted his tie, his tone smooth. "The witness was unavailable until recently, but their testimony is crucial to understanding the full context of this case." The judge sighed, clearly displeased. "Very well. Call your witness." The doors opened, and a woman in a tailored suit walked in. She looked polished, confident, and unnervingly composed. She introduced herself as Miranda Fields, a consultant who claimed to have worked with Richard for several years. "Ms. Fields," the defense attorney began, "can you tell us about Mr. Campbell's business practices?" Miranda smiled faintly. "Of course. I've worked with Mr. Campbell on numerous projects, and I can confidently say he runs his business with integrity. The accusations against him are exaggerated, if not entirely fabricated." David's jaw tightened. This was a calculated move, a character witness meant to paint Richard as a victim of slander. But David wasn't buying it. "Can you speak to the allegations of bribery and fraud?" the lawyer asked. "I can," Miranda replied smoothly. "In my experience, Mr. Campbell has always operated within the bounds of the law. Any irregularities are likely the result of administrative errors, not intentional wrongdoing." David glanced at the jury, noticing a few skeptical expressions. Miranda's testimony was polished, but it lacked the raw evidence that had already been presented. The prosecution was quick to cross-examine. "Ms. Fields, you say you've worked with Mr. Campbell for years. Were you aware of the offshore accounts tied to his name?" Miranda hesitated for the briefest moment. "I was not. And are you familiar with the audio recordings presented earlier, where Mr. Campbell admitted to threatening tenants?" "I've heard them, yes," she said, her composure faltering slightly. "But I believe they were taken out of context." The prosecutor pressed further, poking holes in Miranda's testimony. By the time she stepped down, her credibility had been shaken, but the defense had succeeded in planting a seed of doubt. As the trial continued, the tension only grew. David couldn't shake the feeling that Richard had another move up his sleeve. And he was right. Just as the judge was about to call for closing arguments, Richard's lawyer stood once more. "Your Honor," he said, "my client would like to take the stand." A collective gasp filled the room. Susan gripped David's arm. "This is it," she whispered. "His last gamble." Richard rose slowly, his expression calm. He walked to the stand and swore the oath, then turned to face the jury. "I know what you've heard today paints me as a villain," he began, his voice steady. "But the truth is far more complicated." For the next 30 minutes, Richard spun a story of misunderstanding and victimhood. He claimed the recordings were doctored, the documents forged, and the witnesses coerced. He even shed a few tears, describing the toll the trial had taken on his family. But just as he finished, David noticed something odd. Susan was staring at her phone, her eyes wide. "What is it?" David whispered. She leaned in, her voice low. "I just got a message from Eric. He found something new." David's heart raced. "What?" Susan hesitated, then showed him her phone. On the screen was a photo of a hidden compartment in Richard's office. Inside were files Eric had managed to photograph before they disappeared. "We need to get this to the prosecutor," Susan said urgently. "Right now." As Richard continued his testimony, David and Susan exchanged a glance. The trial wasn't over, not by a long shot, and the next move could change everything. David's heart raced as he and Susan quietly slipped out of the courtroom during a brief recess. The photo on Susan's phone felt like a ticking time bomb. If Eric's discovery was as incriminating as it seemed, it could shatter Richard's carefully constructed narrative. They found Eric waiting in a small office just down the hall, his face pale but determined. On the table in front of him was a manila folder stuffed with papers. "I couldn't get everything," Eric said, his voice low, "but I got enough." David opened the folder and froze. The documents were damning. Bank statements showing massive transfers to offshore accounts, fake invoices tied to city contracts, and even emails where Richard explicitly instructed his team to falsify eviction notices. One email in particular caught David's eye. It was addressed to Miranda Fields, the defense's surprise witness, and outlined her role in covering up discrepancies during audits. "This is it," Susan whispered. "This is what we've been waiting for." David nodded, his hands trembling as he held the evidence. "We need to get this to the prosecutor. Now." Back in the courtroom, Richard was wrapping up his testimony. He played the part of a wronged man perfectly, his voice breaking as he spoke about his family and reputation. "All I've ever done is work hard to build a life for myself and my employees," he said, looking directly at the jury. "These accusations are baseless, and I trust you'll see the truth." The defense attorney sat down, clearly satisfied with Richard's performance. But the prosecutor stood, her expression sharp. "Your Honor," she said, "before I proceed with cross-examination, I'd like to request a brief delay. New evidence has come to light that directly contradicts Mr. Campbell's testimony." The judge frowned. "New evidence? What evidence?" The prosecutor motioned toward David and Susan, who had just re-entered the room with a manila folder. "Your Honor, this evidence was obtained from a whistleblower during the recess. It includes documents and correspondence directly tying Mr. Campbell to illegal activities." Richard's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection. This is highly irregular. We have no way of verifying these documents." The judge raised a hand. "Enough. Bring the evidence forward." David's heart pounded as he handed the folder to the clerk, who quickly passed it to the judge. The room was silent as she reviewed the contents, her expression growing darker with each page. "Prosecution," the judge said, her voice clipped. "You may proceed." The prosecutor wasted no time. She approached the stand, holding up one of the emails. "Mr. Campbell, can you explain this correspondence with Ms. Miranda Fields? It appears to instruct her to falsify audit reports." Richard's composure faltered for a split second before he regained it. "That email is a fake," he said firmly. "I've never seen it before." The prosecutor smiled faintly. "Is that so?" "Because this email was retrieved from your company's server. We can verify its authenticity." Richard's lawyer objected, but the judge overruled him. The prosecutor pressed on, presenting more documents, each one chipping away at Richard's defense. The jury's earlier sympathy was quickly evaporating. Months earlier, David had never imagined himself in this position. The idea of taking on someone as powerful as Richard Campbell had seemed impossible. But now, with every piece of evidence they uncovered, he felt closer to justice. It hadn't been easy. Eric had risked everything to get the documents, sneaking into Richard's office late at night. He'd almost been caught, and the stress of it showed in his pale face and shaking hands. But his bravery had paid off. "This is bigger than we thought," Eric had told David after retrieving the files. "Richard isn't just evicting people. He's running an entire network of corruption. If we can expose this, we can take him down for good." David had felt a surge of hope at Eric's words. But he also knew the danger wasn't over. Richard's enforcers were still out there, and they wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who got too close to the truth. In the courtroom, the tension reached a boiling point as the prosecutor revealed the final piece of evidence, a recording Eric had recovered from the hidden compartment in Richard's office. The audio was faint but clear, capturing a conversation between Richard and an unnamed associate. "We can't let this go public," Richard's voice said. "If those tenants talk, it's over for us. Handle it. Whatever it takes." The room erupted in gasps. Richard's lawyer tried to object, but the damage was done. The jury's expressions were a mix of shock and anger, and even the judge looked visibly disturbed. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "this recording, combined with the documents we've presented, proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Mr. Campbell orchestrated a campaign of fraud, intimidation, and corruption." The judge banged her gavel. "The court will take a short recess to review this new evidence." As everyone filed out of the courtroom, Richard glared at David, his eyes filled with fury. "You think this is over?" he hissed. "You have no idea what you've started." David met his gaze, unflinching. "Neither do you." During the recess, David and Susan sat together in the hallway, their nerves frayed. "This has to be it," Susan said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's no way he can talk his way out of this." David nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that Richard still had something up his sleeve. He thought about the threats, the attacks, and the lengths Richard had gone to in order to protect his empire. When the court reconvened, the judge's face was unreadable as she took her seat. She glanced at the jury, then at the defense table. "Mr. Campbell," she began, her voice cold, "the evidence presented against you is overwhelming. However, before we proceed, I must address a troubling development." David's heart sank. He looked at Susan, who appeared equally confused. "What development?" The judge continued. "During the recess, a witness came forward with new allegations. This trial may be only the beginning of a much larger investigation." Before anyone could respond, the doors to the courtroom opened, and two federal agents stepped inside. One of them approached the judge, whispering something in her ear. The judge's expression tightened. "Ladies and gentlemen, this court is adjourned until further notice. Mr. Campbell, you are to remain in custody pending an investigation into these new allegations." The agents moved toward Richard, who stood frozen, his face pale. But as they cuffed him and began to lead him away, he turned to David one last time. "You've made a mistake," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You don't know who you're dealing with." David watched him go, a mix of relief and dread coursing through him. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. As the courtroom emptied, David and Susan sat in stunned silence. Richard's parting words echoed in David's mind, a dark promise that sent a shiver down his spine. The federal agents who had taken Richard away hinted at something much larger than the trial, a network of corruption that could reach farther than anyone had imagined. Susan broke the silence. "This isn't just about Richard anymore," she said quietly. "If the feds are involved, it means there are bigger players in this." David nodded, his jaw tightening. "And if Richard thinks he still has power, he's probably right. We're not safe." Eric approached them, his face pale but resolute. "You guys need to be careful," he said. "I worked for him long enough to know he has connections everywhere. This isn't over." The next few days passed in a blur. The trial had been put on hold, but the media frenzy around the case only grew. David found himself thrust into the spotlight as reporters swarmed him with questions. He tried to stay focused, but the weight of the attention and the lingering threat from Richard wore on him. One evening, as David returned to the shelter where he'd been staying, he noticed a black car parked across the street. It wasn't unusual for cars to be in the area, but something about this one felt off. The windows were tinted, and the engine was idling as if someone were waiting. David quickened his pace, his heart pounding. As he reached the door, the car's headlights flashed, momentarily blinding him. When his vision cleared, the car sped off into the night. He rushed inside, locking the door behind him. Susan called moments later, her voice urgent. "David, are you okay?" "I'm fine," he said, though his voice shook. "Why?" "I just got a call from one of the reporters who's been following the case. She said she heard that Richard's associates are still active. They might be trying to intimidate witnesses." David swallowed hard. "They already are." The federal investigation moved quickly, and soon, more arrests were made. Several city officials were taken into custody, accused of accepting bribes from Richard in exchange for turning a blind eye to his illegal activities. The news brought a sense of vindication to David, but it also painted a clearer picture of how deep the corruption ran. One night, Susan showed up at the shelter with a laptop. "We need to talk," she said, setting it on the table. She pulled up an email from an anonymous sender. The subject line read, "You're next." "What is this?" David asked, his stomach sinking. Susan's face was grim. "I don't know who sent it, but it's a threat. It came to my personal account, and it mentions you by name." David read the email, his pulse quickening. It was short but chilling. "David thinks he's a hero, but heroes fall. Stay out of this, or you'll regret it." "This isn't just intimidation anymore," Susan said. "It's a warning." David clenched his fists. "I'm not backing down. If they think they can scare me off, they're wrong." But the truth was he was scared. Every shadow, every unexpected noise made his heart race. He knew Richard's reach extended far beyond the courtroom, and if he wanted to silence David, he had the resources to do it. A week later, David and Susan met with the federal agents handling the case. Agent Lisa Carter, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes, outlined the broader scope of the investigation. "Richard Campbell wasn't acting alone," she explained. "We've uncovered evidence of a larger syndicate involved in money laundering, fraud, and even human trafficking. His properties were just a front." David felt a chill run down his spine. "How is this connected to the trial?" "Your case brought it to light," Agent Carter said. "But now that the syndicate knows we're onto them, they're likely to retaliate. You need to be careful." "What about protection?" Susan asked. "David's already been threatened." "We're working on it," Carter said. "But resources are stretched thin. In the meantime, avoid drawing attention to yourselves." It wasn't exactly reassuring. As David and Susan left the meeting, they both felt the weight of the situation. That night, David lay awake in the shelter, his thoughts racing. The trial, the threats, the syndicate, it all felt overwhelming. He thought about how far he'd come, from a homeless man fighting for justice to a key player in a federal investigation. But he also thought about the cost. As he drifted into an uneasy sleep, a loud crash jolted him awake. He sat up, his heart pounding. Someone was outside, pounding on the door. "David," a voice shouted. It was Susan. He ran to the door and opened it to find her standing there, out of breath. "What's going on?" he asked. "They broke into my apartment," she said, her voice trembling. "Whoever it was, they trashed the place. I barely got out." David's blood ran cold. "You think it's Richard's people?" Susan nodded. "They left this." She held up a piece of paper with a single word scrawled across it. "Quit." David stared at it, his fear replaced by a simmering anger. "We're not quitting," he said firmly. "If they think they can scare us, they're wrong." But deep down, he knew this wasn't just about scaring them. This was a warning, and it was only a matter of time before things escalated. The next morning, David and Susan went back to the federal building to report the incident. Agent Carter listened intently, her expression growing more serious with every detail. "We'll increase security," she said. "But you need to understand, these people are dangerous. If they feel cornered, they won't hesitate to act." David nodded, his resolve hardening. "Let them come," he said. "I'm not afraid of them anymore." But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. He had started this fight, but now it had spiraled into something much bigger and far more dangerous. And the worst was yet to come. The following days were a blur of heightened tension and constant vigilance. The federal agents had assigned a plainclothes officer to watch over David and Susan, but it did little to ease their anxiety. The break-in at Susan's apartment was a stark reminder that Richard's associates were not just watching. They were ready to act. David began noticing subtle signs that he was being followed. The same black sedan parked near the shelter, unfamiliar faces lingering outside the courthouse. Susan received more cryptic emails, each one more threatening than the last. The words weren't just meant to intimidate. They were calculated, personal, and specific. One night, as David left a late meeting with Susan and Eric, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. He turned, but the empty street revealed nothing. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there, watching from the shadows. The next day, the trial resumed. The prosecution, armed with the damning evidence Eric had uncovered, delivered a powerful argument that left Richard's defense team scrambling. The emails, the offshore accounts, the audio recordings, it all painted a picture of systematic corruption that was impossible to ignore. The prosecutor, pacing before the jury, delivered the final blow. Mr. Campbell's empire wasn't built on hard work or integrity. It was built on lies, exploitation, and fear. And today, justice demands accountability. The defense, visibly rattled, tried to shift the narrative. They called witnesses to paint Richard as a charitable businessman. But the jury's skeptical expressions showed that the prosecution's evidence had left an indelible mark. That evening, David and Susan celebrated a small victory. The trial was nearing its end, and the prosecution had delivered a strong case. But the weight of the threats still hung over them. As they sat in a quiet diner, Eric joined them, his face pale and drawn. "I got another message," he said, sliding his phone across the table. The screen displayed a text message from an unknown number. "You're next, Mason." David's stomach dropped. "They're trying to silence us?" Eric nodded, his hands trembling. "I don't know how much longer I can do this." "You can," Susan said firmly. "We're in this together. They want us to quit because they know we're winning." David looked at Eric. "She's right. If we back down now, everything we've fought for will mean nothing." Eric nodded slowly, though the fear in his eyes remained. The next morning, David woke to the sound of his phone buzzing. He answered groggily, but the voice on the other end jolted him awake. "David, it's Agent Carter. We need to talk. Now." David dressed quickly and met Susan at the federal building. Agent Carter was waiting for them, her face grim. She gestured for them to follow her into a private conference room, where a large screen displayed surveillance footage. "This was taken last night outside the shelter," she said, pressing play. The video showed the black sedan David had seen before. Two men stepped out, their faces obscured by hoods. They circled the building, lingering near the entrance before disappearing out of frame. "We believe these are associates of Richard Campbell," Carter said. "We also found this." She handed David a small plastic evidence bag containing a folded note. Scrawled across it were the words, "You're running out of time." Susan's face hardened. "What are you doing to stop them?" Carter sighed. "We're doing everything we can, but these people are professionals. They've been operating in the shadows for years. It's going to take time to dismantle their network." David clenched his fists. "What about us?" "They're targeting us now. We're assigning additional security," Carter said. "But I need you to stay vigilant. Stick to public places, don't travel alone. And if anything seems off, call us immediately." That night, David stayed awake, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The threats, the surveillance, the break-in, it was all leading to something bigger. Around midnight, he heard a noise outside his window. He froze, his heart pounding. Slowly, he crept to the window and peeked outside. At first, he saw nothing. But then, in the faint glow of the street lights, he spotted a figure standing across the street. The person was dressed in dark clothing, their face obscured. They stood motionless, staring directly at his window. David's breath caught in his throat. He fumbled for his phone, but when he looked back, the figure was gone. The incident left him shaken, but he didn't report it. He knew the agents were overwhelmed, and he didn't want to appear paranoid. Instead, he resolved to keep moving forward. The next day in court, the prosecution called its final witness, an auditor who had reviewed the financial records recovered from Richard's office. Her testimony was damning, outlining a clear pattern of fraud and embezzlement. But as the trial neared its conclusion, the defense made one last desperate move. They requested to call a new witness, someone they claimed could exonerate Richard. The judge, though clearly skeptical, allowed it. The courtroom fell silent as the witness entered, a man in his late 40s, dressed in an expensive suit. He introduced himself as Jonathan Pierce, a longtime business associate of Richard's. "Mr. Pierce," the defense attorney began, "can you speak to Mr. Campbell's character and business practices?" Jonathan nodded. "I've known Richard for over 20 years. He's always been a man of integrity. These accusations are completely out of character." The prosecutor stood, her expression sharp. "Mr. Pierce, Are you aware of the evidence presented against Mr. Campbell? I am, Jonathan said confidently, and I believe much of it has been misinterpreted or taken out of context. The prosecutor narrowed her eyes. Is that so? Because we have reason to believe you're involved in Mr. Campbell's activities. Jonathan's composure faltered for a split second. That's absurd, he said, though his voice wavered slightly. The prosecutor held up a document. This is a record of a wire transfer from one of Mr. Campbell's shell companies to an account in your name. Care to explain? The courtroom erupted in whispers. Jonathan's face turned pale. I don't know what that is. Then perhaps you can explain this, the prosecutor said, producing another document. An email exchange between you and Mr. Campbell, discussing the use of fake leases to inflate property values. Jonathan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Your Honor, the prosecutor said, we request that Mr. Pierce's financial records be subpoenaed. It's clear he has direct knowledge of Mr. Campbell's operations. The judge granted the request, and Jonathan was escorted out of the courtroom, visibly shaken. That evening, as David and Susan left the courthouse, they were surrounded by reporters. David pushed through the crowd, his mind focused on the trial. But as they reached the street, a loud bang shattered the air. David ducked instinctively, pulling Susan down with him. Chaos erupted as people screamed and scattered. He looked up to see a bullet hole in the courthouse wall, inches from where they had been standing. Sniper! Someone shouted. David's blood ran cold. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. It was an assassination attempt. The air was filled with chaos, screaming, running, and the distant wail of approaching sirens. David clutched Susan's arm as they crouched behind a parked car, hearts pounding in unison. The realization that someone had tried to kill them settled heavily in their chests. Susan's face was pale, her breaths coming in short gasps. David, she whispered, her voice trembling. They're not just threatening us anymore. David glanced at the bullet hole in the courthouse wall, his mind racing. The shot had been precise, calculated. Whoever pulled the trigger wanted them to know they weren't untouchable. Federal agents swarmed the area within minutes, securing the perimeter and ushering witnesses into safety. Agent Carter arrived, her expression sharp and full of urgency. Are you hurt? She asked, her eyes darting between David and Susan. We're fine, David replied, though his voice shook. But that was close. Carter's jaw tightened. This changes everything. Whoever did this is sending a message, and we need to take it seriously. Susan stepped forward, her fear replaced by anger. You need to find out who's behind this. We can't keep living like this, constantly looking over our shoulders. We will, Carter assured her. But for now, you're both going into protective custody. It's not safe for you to stay out in the open. David and Susan were relocated to a safe house on the outskirts of the city, a nondescript two-story building surrounded by a dense grove of trees. Agents were stationed around the clock, patrolling the property and monitoring the surrounding area. For the first time in weeks, David felt a fleeting sense of security. But the attack outside the courthouse weighed heavily on him. Someone was desperate to silence him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before they tried again. That night, as he sat in the dimly lit living room, Susan joined him. She carried 2 mugs of coffee, setting one down in front of him before taking a seat. You okay? She asked softly. David shrugged, staring into the dark liquid. I don't know. I keep thinking about how close that bullet came. If we'd been a few inches to the left. Susan reached out, placing a hand on his. But we weren't. We're still here, and that means we still have a chance to finish this. David nodded, her words grounding him. You're right. We've come too far to stop now. The next morning, Agent Carter arrived with an update. We've identified the shooter, she said, wasting no time. It was a professional hitman linked to the syndicate Richard was working with. We believe he was hired to eliminate key witnesses, you two included. David felt a chill run down his spine. Does that mean Richard's still pulling strings from jail? It's likely, Carter said grimly. We're investigating his associates, but these people are careful. They won't leave an obvious trail. Susan frowned. What about Jonathan Pierce? He knows something. He's tied to all of this. Carter nodded. Pierce is being interrogated as we speak. If he cooperates, we might be able to dismantle this network. But if he doesn't—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Time was running out. Meanwhile, in custody, Richard was far from defeated. He sat in a small, sterile room, his hands cuffed to the table. Across from him sat his lawyer, a wiry man with sharp features and an even sharper tongue. "You need to keep this under control," Richard hissed. "The longer this drags on, the more they'll uncover." The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "We're doing everything we can, but the evidence against you is overwhelming. The syndicate isn't happy, Richard. They think you've become a liability." Richard's jaw tightened. "I've kept their secrets for years. They owe me." The lawyer leaned in, lowering his voice. "They don't see it that way. If you don't find a way to end this, they'll cut their losses permanently." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Then we'll make sure David doesn't make it to the stand." "Handle it." Back at the safe house, David and Susan were trying to piece together their next move. Susan had been combing through court documents and media reports, looking for any clues that might connect the syndicate to their current situation. "I keep coming back to this," she said, pointing to an article about a city councilman who had mysteriously resigned 2 years earlier. This councilman, Robert Hensley, was on the Oversight Committee for Housing Regulations. He disappeared right after signing off on several of Richard's developments. David leaned over, reading the article. "You think he was involved?" "Maybe," Susan said. "Or maybe he knew something he wasn't supposed to." Before they could dig deeper, the sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet. Both of them froze, their eyes locking in mutual alarm. "Stay here," David whispered, grabbing a heavy flashlight from the table. He crept toward the source of the noise, his heart hammering in his chest. As he rounded the corner, he saw a shadow moving near the back window. He raised the flashlight, ready to defend himself, when the figure turned, and it wasn't an attacker. It was Eric. "What the hell are you doing here?" David demanded, lowering the flashlight. Eric held up his hands, his face pale and panicked. "I didn't know where else to go. They're after me." David pulled him inside, locking the door behind him. "Who's after you?" "The syndicate," Eric said, his voice shaking. "I overheard something big. They're planning to take out the prosecutor." David's stomach dropped. "What?" "They think if they get rid of her, the case will fall apart," Eric explained. "I heard them talking about it. They're going to make it look like an accident." Susan joined them, her face pale. "We have to warn her." David nodded. "Eric, can you tell Agent Carter what you heard?" Eric hesitated, fear etched across his face. "If I do, they'll know it was me." "They already know," David said firmly. "You're not safe until we take them down." Eric swallowed hard but nodded. "Okay, let's do it." The three of them called Agent Carter and relayed Eric's information. She was visibly alarmed but acted quickly, dispatching a protective detail to the prosecutor's home. "Eric's testimony could be the key to taking this syndicate down," Carter said. "But you all need to be careful. If they know we're onto them, they'll escalate." David's resolve hardened. The attack outside the courthouse, the threats, the hitman, everything was leading to this moment. They were closer than ever to exposing the truth. But the danger had never been greater. As the sun set over the safe house, David stood by the window, staring into the darkening woods. He knew the fight wasn't over, and the next move could be their last. In the distance, the faint sound of rustling leaves caught his attention. His pulse quickened as he scanned the tree line. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow move, but when he blinked, it was gone. "David," Susan called from behind him. "What's wrong?" He turned, his face tense. "They're here." The safe house erupted into chaos. David's warning sent Susan and Eric scrambling to secure the doors and windows. The agents stationed outside shouted orders, their voices muffled by the thick walls. The rustling in the trees grew louder, and David's instinct screamed that this was no false alarm. "They're coming," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "We need to get out of here." Susan grabbed Eric's arm. "We can't just run. They'll pick us off if we leave the house." David scanned the room, his mind racing. "The basement," he said suddenly. "We can hold out there until the agents push them back." They moved quickly, descending into the narrow, dimly lit basement. David grabbed a heavy wrench from a workbench, his grip tightening as adrenaline coursed through his veins. Susan found an old metal rod, while Eric armed himself with a flashlight. Above them, muffled shouts and the crack of gunfire pierced the air. The attackers had breached the perimeter, and the agents were struggling to hold them off. David motioned for Susan and Eric to stay quiet, his ears straining for any sound of movement. A loud crash came from above as the front door was kicked in. Heavy boots thudded against the floorboards, followed by hushed voices giving orders. "They're inside," Susan whispered, her face pale. David nodded. "Stay behind me." The basement door creaked open, and the beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness. David held his breath as footsteps descended the stairs. The first figure appeared, a man dressed in black, his face partially obscured by a mask. David didn't hesitate. He swung the wrench with all his strength, striking the man in the shoulder and sending him tumbling backward. The attacker's flashlight clattered to the ground, illuminating the chaos as more footsteps thundered above. Another man appeared at the top of the stairs, shouting into a radio. "They're in the basement." David cursed under his breath. They were cornered, and the attackers were closing in. He turned to Susan and Eric. "We have to make a break for it." "How?" Susan asked, her voice trembling. David pointed to a small basement window near the ceiling. "We climb out and head for the woods. It's our only chance." Eric hesitated. "What if they're waiting for us out there?" "They'll kill us if we stay," David said. "We don't have a choice." One by one, they climbed through the narrow window, emerging into the cold night air. The forest loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, but it offered their only chance of survival. David led the way, his heart pounding as they plunged into the trees. Behind them, the safe house was ablaze with activity. Gunfire echoed through the night, and the shouts of agents and attackers grew fainter as they ran deeper into the woods. David glanced over his shoulder, ensuring Susan and Eric were keeping up. "Keep moving," he urged. "We have to put as much distance as we can between us and them." The forest was a maze of twisted branches and uneven terrain. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through David. He knew they couldn't outrun their pursuers forever. They needed a plan. Up ahead, he spotted a narrow ravine. "Over there," he called, leading them to the edge. The drop was steep but manageable, and it would help conceal their movements. One by one, they climbed down, their hands scraping against the rough rock. At the bottom, they huddled together, catching their breath. "What now?" Eric asked, his voice shaking. David scanned the darkness, his mind racing. "We wait. If they follow us, we'll hear them coming. If they don't, we'll head for the highway and flag down help." Susan nodded, her face grim. "And if they find us?" David tightened his grip on the wrench. "Then we fight." Minutes passed like hours. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound their labored breathing. David's ears strained for any hint of pursuit, but the woods remained still. Finally, Susan broke the silence. "Do you think they've given up?" David shook his head. "No, they're regrouping." As if on cue, a distant voice shattered the quiet. "Spread out." They couldn't have gone far. David's heart sank. The attackers were closing in, and the ravine wouldn't hide them for long. He turned to Susan and Eric. "When I say go, run for the highway. Don't look back." "What about you?" Susan asked, panic rising in her voice. "I'll hold them off," David said firmly. "You need to get out of here and tell Agent Carter what's happening." "No," Susan said, her eyes brimming with tears. "We're not leaving you." "You have to," David insisted. "This is bigger than me. If you don't make it out, everything we've fought for will be lost." Eric hesitated, then nodded. "We'll come back for you." David forced a smile. "I know." The footsteps grew louder, the attackers fanning out across the forest. David motioned for Susan and Eric to move, and they reluctantly obeyed, disappearing into the darkness. He turned back toward the ravine's edge, gripping the wrench tightly as he prepared to face whatever came next. When the attackers reached the ravine, they found David standing at the bottom, his silhouette framed by the faint glow of the moon. He didn't flinch as they descended, their weapons trained on him. "Where are they?" one of the men demanded. David smirked. "You'll have to go through me to find out." The men hesitated, clearly surprised by his defiance. But their leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "Fine," he said, leveling his gun at David. "Have it your way." Before he could pull the trigger, a deafening crack echoed through the forest. One of the attackers crumpled to the ground, a bullet hole in his chest. The others whirled around, their confusion quickly turning to panic as federal agents emerged from the trees, their guns drawn. "Drop your weapons." Agent Carter's voice rang out, authoritative and unyielding. The attackers hesitated, but the sight of a dozen armed agents left them no choice. They surrendered, their weapons clattering to the ground. David sagged with relief as Carter approached, her expression a mix of anger and admiration. "You're a damn fool," she said. "But you bought us enough time to catch them." "Did Susan and Eric make it?" David asked, his voice hoarse. "They're safe," Carter said. "And thanks to you, so is this case." In the days that followed, the syndicate unraveled. With the attackers in custody and Eric's testimony corroborating the evidence, Richard Campbell's empire crumbled. More arrests were made, and the full extent of his network was exposed. David, Susan, and Eric were hailed as heroes, their bravery ensuring justice for countless victims. But for David, the real victory wasn't the recognition. It was the knowledge that he had stood up to the system that tried to break him and won. As he walked out of the courthouse for the final time, the sun shining on his face, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: freedom. He had fought back, and against all odds, he had prevailed.